Welcome to Too Fond of Books. My name is Janelle and this is a reading roundup. In this video I'm going to talk about 7 books that I've read recently, and for the most part they have been really good books. I've been reading a lot recently and just really enjoying the books that I've been reading, but there's 7 of them, so let's just dive straight in. I read the latest in C.S. Harris's Sebastian St. Cyr mystery, Who Speaks for the Damned. This is a historical mystery series set in England in the early 1800s, the Regency period, and I have to say that this is potentially my favorite historical mystery series. It is definitely in my top 5 historical mystery series, but possibly my favorite. I gave this book 5 stars, and I went back and I checked, and I have given a good number of the books in this series 5 stars. It's just a really well written historical mystery series. The characters are fantastic, and the issues, the social issues that the author highlights in her mysteries are really interesting, and this book is no different. So, Sebastian St. Cyr is the son of an earl. He is married to a woman called Hero, who is the daughter of Lord Jarvis, who is cousin to the king and really high up politically. Like, he is like, I would say potentially the #1 advisor for the Prince Regent, and someone who has his fingers in all the pies, and has a great amount of political clout and power. So one thing that is really interesting about the characters in this book is that Lord Jarvis greatly dislikes Sebastian, and if he wasn't married to his daughter would probably have had him killed. So that adds some great tension. Sebastian has a very strong sense of justice and what is right, and gets himself involved in cases often purely for that reason. Hero has an equally strong sense of justice and what is right, but for her that looks different, and what she is currently in the middle of is writing a series of articles for, I believe it's newspapers, but it could be magazines, about the poor. And so she gets really specific, and so in this book she's writing a series of articles about street musicians, and so in order to write the articles, she will go out and she will interview people for whatever specific article that she's written. So in the past, she's written articles about children who live on the streets. I think specifically street sweepers was one of them. And so she would go out and find and just talk to street sweepers. And so in this book, she talks to street musicians, and she uses these very specific topics to highlight the plight of the poor. And so I always find that very interesting. But in Who Speaks for the Damned, a body is found dead in a tea garden, and it turns out to be the son of an earl who was convicted of murder and transported to Botany Bay, and whom everyone believed had died at least 18 years before. So he had been, 18 years before is when he was convicted. People have believed him to be dead for a very long time, probably at least 10 years. I can't remember. But anyway, it's his body that turns up dead in a tea garden, and the mystery of what actually happened to him, and also whether or not he was actually guilty of the crime he was convicted of, are all things that Sebastian gets himself involved in. And I have to say, this book is, I think, the 16th in the series. Let me check. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, It's the 15th in the series, and probably one of my favorites. This is a series that just keeps getting better and better, and I can't recommend it highly enough, and I gave Who Speaks for the Damned 5 stars. I read Girl at War by Sara Novic. Now, I read this for my Around the World challenge. This will count for Croatia, and this is a historical fiction dual timeline book that I really quite enjoyed. I gave it 4 stars. It's a debut novel, and it was very well written for a debut novel. The story is about a girl called Anna who grew up in Croatia, but at the time it was Yugoslavia. She lived in Zagreb, and when she was 10 years old, war broke out. And so the story is about what happened to her when she was 10 years old. And then the other timeline is Anna in New York City in 2001. And it was just really good. There was really interesting stuff in here about the war between all the various people involved in Croatia at the time, and how very complicated all of that was. Interestingly, though, learning about it through the eyes of a 10-year-old, I thought was really interesting. And then Anna, 10 years later in New York City, still struggling to come to terms with what happened, the consequences of what happened. It was a really good book. I gave it 4 stars, and I would recommend it. And then I read Pride and Prejudice and Zombies. This was on my pile of books that was left over from Jane Austen July. And I got this out of the library just because I was curious. I had heard that it's the text of Pride and Prejudice with zombie elements written into it, and I was just intrigued. So that's why it says that it's written by Jane Austen and Seth Grahame-Smith. And having just read Pride and Prejudice, I thought that I would give this a whirl. And honestly, this book is utterly ridiculous, totally silly, and yet very entertaining. I honestly found the idea of Elizabeth Bennet and her sisters fighting unmentionables, as they're called in here, just hilarious. They talk about their history of training in China. Yes, they're training in China, and how they're described as kick-ass, and I really liked that. And so I tabbed a couple of things in here that I thought were very entertaining. So the first one was a reminder of how it's very interesting to read a book like this in the middle of a global pandemic. And so this is Darcy, a quote. He says, "I cannot comprehend the neglect of a family library in such days as these. What have we to do but stay indoors and read till the cure is at last discovered?" Right? Yes, I agree with Mr. Darcy. And then I also highlighted, this is about Elizabeth is visiting Charlotte, and when she first meets Lady Catherine, who in this book is also a warrior, described as a warrior, a very good one, and she keeps a private guard of ninjas, which is just frankly hilarious. But anyway, this is the description in here of Lady Catherine. Lady Catherine was a tall, large woman with strongly marked features, which might once have been handsome. Her once flawless figure had been softened by age, but her eyes were no less striking than Elizabeth had oft heard them described. They were the eyes of a woman who once held the wrath of God in her hands. Elizabeth wondered how much quickness those famed hands still possessed. I loved that. They were the eyes of a woman who once held the wrath of God in her hands. So So good. Okay, and then one more. So there obviously are changes to the story in a book like this, and one thing that I love is, and this is a spoiler, and I'm just gonna say it. I'll put spoiler on the bottom of the screen, but that Wickham has an accident that leaves him completely crippled, and Lydia has to take care of him. And I love the justice in that, and that in this book anyway, the people who we consider the baddies get their just desserts. And so yeah, so this was utterly ridiculous, and yet I still quite enjoyed the read, and I gave it 3 stars. I read the latest in the Amory Ames historical mystery series called A Dangerous Engagement by Ashley Weaver. This is a historical mystery series set in England in the 30s. But in this outing, it's the 6th in the series. Amory and her husband travel to New York for a wedding. And a man who is in the wedding party is shot on the steps of the house that they are staying at, the bride's home. And that's the mystery. So we are in New York City in, I think it's 1934, 33 or 34, Prohibition 33, October 33. So Prohibition is still in place, although it is there is talk of it being repealed, and so there is, of course, you know, speakeasies are involved in here, and bootlegging and all of that stuff. The kind of the ramifications of the stock market crash are part of this story. But I have to say that this was not my favorite in the my favorite outing in the series. I found that it was a bit repetitive, and Amory's continual justification for her involvement in the case just got a bit much for me in this book, and so it wasn't my favorite in the series, although this is still a series that I do enjoy and I will continue to read, and I gave this one 3 stars. And then I read Marilla of Green Gables by Sara McCoy. Now, I love Anne of Green Gables, so there is a huge amount of nostalgia involved in how I feel about this book, but I read the Anne of Green Gables series when I was, I don't know, 12, 13. I'm a Canadian, and you know, I'm very proud that L.M. Montgomery is a Canadian writer. I have been to Prince Edward Island, where Anne of Green Gables is set, and it is gorgeous. And I've just always really loved Anne of Green Gables. It's a historical fiction series set in the very late 1800s about Anne, who is an orphan who is adopted by a brother and sister who live on Prince Edward Island. And I just always felt when I first read it when I was about 12, I think, I just felt an affinity with Anne. I'm not an orphan myself, but I am a redhead like Anne was, and have a bit of a fiery temper like Anne does. And Anne gets herself into these situations. She's very well-meaning, but she gets herself into these situations, which was a lot like me also. So I just have this affinity for Anne. And so I was really curious to see what Sara McCoy did in this book. So Marilla of Green Gables is the story of Marilla before Anne. And I really do think that Sara McCoy did justice to the world that L.M. Montgomery created, and to the characters. I thought it was a really interesting story, and I really enjoyed the aspects of what was going on in the greater society at the time. So there's aspects of the rebellions that happened in 1837 and 38 in Upper and Lower Canada at the time. It was before Canada was declared Canada, and there was some some rebellions and unrest just related to how Canada was governed. And I love that she included that in this book. And I also loved that she included what was going on in the States, because Prince Edward Island and Ontario on the mainland, you know, Lower Ontario, of course, being right on the border, there was the elements of the Underground Railroad and slaves who were being brought across the border for freedom. But then also there ended up being hunters who would come across the border to try and capture them and bring them back. And that was included in this book too. And so I just really appreciated that she brings in the wider historical and political situation into the story, because it can feel really sheltered. Prince Edward Island is a very small island, and often you can feel like this bubble that nothing else is happening in the wider world. And so I did like that she included that, and I gave this 5 stars, and I am going to count it in my Read Canada sub-challenge for my Around the World challenge. And so this is going to count for Prince Edward Island. And I read Harlan Coben's latest book, The Boy from the Woods. This came out this year. This was good. It was just kind of another one of his thrillers. I gave it 4 stars. I did think that there were a few holes, a few things that he didn't quite wrap up or explain towards the end, but it was good. So The Boy from the Woods is a reference to a boy was found years before the events of this book, and a young boy, maybe 6 or 7 years old, had been living in the woods. No one knows who he is and how long he had been living in the woods, and they never discovered the truth. And so they called him Wilde, W-I-L-D-E, which is a little on the nose, but whatever. And so the events of this book take place when he is grown up. He is a man, and a girl goes missing who is a classmate of his godson, and then the events go from there. There's a lot about politics in this book, and some people really like that, and some people are like, eh. And so it was a pretty good outing for Harlan Coben. Yeah, and I don't want to say too much more and spoil things. So yeah, I gave it 4 stars. And then finally, I read The Giver of Stars by Jojo Moyes. I read this because it's a story about the Kentucky pack horse librarians, and that's something that is very intriguing to me. I've read the book Woman of Troublesome Creek, which is also a historical fiction about the Kentucky pack horse librarian project. And after reading this book as well, I would love to find out more about the Kentucky pack horse librarian project. So if anybody knows of a non-fiction book that is about the pack horse librarians, could you let me know in the comment section down below, because I would love to read more about that specific event in history. I find it so very fascinating. So The Giver of Stars is about the pack horse librarians, but it is actually more so about the lives of some of the women that are pack horse librarians. So this book is about 5 women, but really focusing in on 2. So it's set in Kentucky in the 30s, the early 30s. And so of course there's a lot of social and political stuff happening at the time. We're in the middle of a depression. There's all the stuff that goes on with the mines at the time, with unions and the corruption of the bosses and all of that. And there is the race issue in Kentucky. All of those things play a part in this story. But one of the main characters is Alice, who is from England, and she marries a young man from, what's the town called? Baileyville, I think, in Kentucky. And so it's about her, and it's about another pack horse librarian named Marjorie, who she meets. And honestly, my favorite parts of this book were about the descriptions of the library, how it was set up, the descriptions of these women riding out on their routes into the remote parts of the mountains to bring books to people who can't get to libraries. And I find that just really fascinating. So again, like I said, if you have a recommendation for me about learning more about that, if you could let me know in the comment section, I would really appreciate that. And I gave this 5 stars. Sorry, no, I didn't. I gave it 4 stars. Okay, and so that's what I've read recently. Have you read any of these books? I would love to talk about them with you in the comment section down below. Do any of these books sound interesting? Let's chat, because I love to talk about books and I love to talk with you about books. And I will see you for another video soon. Bye.